Hi, everyone. Welcome. Today, we're jumping into a really big question. What is a family? It seems like a simple concept, but defining it turns out to be more complicated than you might expect. We'll start by talking about why it's so hard to pin down a definition and look at some common features that families tend to share, things like emotional closeness and mutual support. Then we'll consider a broader definition of family that goes well beyond the traditional nuclear model, and we'll explore the roles families play when it comes to things like economics, socialization, and living arrangements. Later on, we'll shift gears and talk about the so-called decline of the family. Some argue that rising divorce rates, more single-parent households, and cohabitation are signs that families are breaking down. But others see these changes not as decline, but as evolution, families adjusting to new social, cultural, and economic realities. It's important to recognize that family structures change over time because society changes. Our laws, our jobs, our gender roles, and our expectations are all evolving, and families shift along with them. So let's dive in and explore how families are both changing and staying the same. Let's begin with the traditional view of what a family is. In the mid-20th century, think the 1940s through the 1960s, the family was often seen as the building block of society. The typical image was a man and a woman, legally married, living together with their children. This couple shared a home, divided labor based on gender roles, and raised kids together. This image was especially common in post-war North America. Economic stability, a booming housing market, and strong pressure to conform all helped reinforce the nuclear family model. Popular media portrayed this structure as the ideal, and many people aspired to it, even if their real lives didn't match it. But even though this model was promoted as the norm, it never represented the full picture. Families have always been more diverse than that. Different forms of family life have existed across cultures and history, so while this traditional version became iconic, it was never the only way to be a family. For example, Indigenous communities in Canada have long had family structures built around extended kinship and collective care, something very different from the nuclear ideal. Next, let's talk about the concept known as the Standard North American Family, or SNAF for short. This is the idea that the proper family consists of a legally married man and woman living in the same household, with the man earning the income and the woman running the home. It's closely tied to the idea of the nuclear family, a couple with their children all under one roof. This image was especially dominant in the 20th century and came with lots of expectations about how people should behave within a family. For instance, it reinforced gender norms, where a man's value was tied to his role as a provider and a woman's identity centered on caregiving. But the reality today is far more varied. Many families don't fit into this mold anymore, and that sparked ongoing conversations about how we define family in the present day. In fact, the persistence of the SNAF as an ideal can create challenges for families that don't fit it, such as LGBTQ plus families, cohabiting partners, or multi-generational households when it comes to gaining recognition or accessing services. Different institutions define family in different ways, and those definitions matter. From a religious point of view, family is often framed in terms of duty and morality, with strong emphasis on marriage, having children, and maintaining traditional roles. These ideas can strongly shape community expectations and can also affect how people view their obligations within the family. Governments define families through laws. These definitions cover marriage, divorce, custody, and inheritance, and they can vary not just from one country to another, but even between provinces. They also change over time to reflect shifting values, like the legal recognition of same-sex marriage, which significantly reshaped how families are understood under Canadian law. Then there are official definitions used by institutions like social services or census bureaus. These often focus on who shares a home or economic resources. Definitions like these help decide who qualifies for things like healthcare, tax breaks, or social benefits. What's key here is that these official definitions can really shape people's lives. Depending on the program, a partner might have to be legally married to qualify, or a common law spouse might be treated the same. The bottom line is, how we define family isn't just symbolic. It can affect real access to support, benefits, and recognition. When we look at statistics, we'll often come across the term census family. This refers to a small, immediate family unit, typically a married or common law couple with or without children, or a lone parent living with at least one child. This kind of definition is practical for statistical tracking, especially when measuring trends like birth rates, divorce, or household sizes. But it can also leave out a lot of real-life complexity. For example, a grandparent raising grandchildren or two adult siblings living together wouldn't always count as a census family, even if they clearly function like one. By contrast, the economic family is defined more broadly. It includes anyone related by blood, marriage, common law, or adoption who lives in the same household. So this might include siblings, grandparents, or other extended relatives. This definition is more reflective of how households actually function, especially when it comes to shared resources, responsibilities, and economic support. In many cultures, extended families regularly live and work together, and this broader view captures that reality more accurately. Outside of formal definitions, like those used by governments or census agencies, our everyday understanding of family is much more flexible and personal. In everyday conversation, advertising, and media, we often see family used in ways that go far beyond legal or biological ties. Think of slogans like, "When you're here, you're family," or "Because pets are family too." These messages reflect how companies and culture tap into our emotional connection to the idea of family, not necessarily to describe a household, but to evoke feelings of comfort, trust, and belonging. This shows that people often define family based on emotional closeness, not official categories. We also see this in the idea of fictive kin. That's when people treat close friends, godparents, or mentors as family, even without legal or biological relationships. These chosen families can be just as strong and supportive as traditional ones, and sometimes even more so, especially for those who are estranged from their biological relatives or living far from home. Cultural background plays a big role here too. In many communities, the concept of family extends to aunts, uncles, cousins, neighbors, or elders who play active roles in daily life. Some cultures prioritize extended family networks, others focus more narrowly on the nuclear family. These differences show how the meaning of family is socially and culturally shaped. So the key takeaway here is this. While governments and institutions may stick to strict definitions for administrative purposes, real-life experiences of family are far more diverse. People create families based on care, connection, and shared responsibility, not just on paperwork or bloodlines. Sociology helps us understand and validate this complexity by recognizing that family is as much a social and emotional category as it is a legal one. Now, let's explore what happens when we focus on what families do instead of how they look. This is known as a functional definition of family. Rather than centering on specific structures, like a two-parent household or a nuclear family, this approach zeroes in on the role family members play in supporting one another. It recognizes that families can take many shapes depending on cultural background, social class, or historical context, but their primary function remains the same. They care for each other's well-being, both emotionally and materially. According to this viewpoint, a family is any group of individuals who share a lasting commitment to looking out for each other's needs. It shifts our attention away from whether people are legally married or biologically related and emphasizes caregiving, emotional support, and mutual assistance. In other words, if people meet each other's essential needs, whether financial, emotional, or practical, they can be considered a family, even if they don't fit the traditional mold. By applying a functional definition, we can include a wide range of experiences and arrangements under the umbrella of family. This inclusive perspective acknowledges that the true essence of family life lies in nurture, support, and caregiving, rather than in specific family forms or structures. It opens the door to understanding and valuing the diverse ways people come together to support one another in today's world. One of the most universal features of families is the presence of strong emotional ties. Families are often the people we turn to for comfort, care, and encouragement. These relationships are built on connection, loyalty, and a sense of belonging. This bond doesn't have to be based on biology. It could come from years of shared experience, caregiving, or deep friendship. In everyday life, we see this in families that include step siblings, adopted children, or even close friends who are treated like relatives. When families function well, these emotional ties help buffer individuals from stress and give them a sense of security and identity. They also shape our long-term well-being, especially when these bonds are formed in childhood. Families also help regulate sexual behavior by defining which relationships are appropriate and which are not. This involves setting cultural boundaries around sexuality, such as prohibiting incest or defining acceptable relationships within marriage. These rules serve a social purpose by protecting vulnerable members and maintaining stable, respectful family dynamics. Although the specific boundaries differ between cultures and historical periods, nearly all societies use the family as a framework to structure sexual norms and expectations. This dimension also connects with broader cultural and moral beliefs about marriage, gender roles, and parenting. Another common aspect of family life is the presence of power dynamics. These can be based on age, gender, income, or social expectations. For example, parents typically have more decision-making power than children, and in many families, the person who earns more money might have more influence over key choices. Sometimes these imbalances are seen as necessary for providing structure and protection, for instance, adults guiding children, but they can also lead to inequality, conflict, or even abuse if not balanced with care and accountability. In sociological terms, families often reflect and reproduce broader power structures in society. So when we talk about power in families, we're also talking about social patterns like patriarchy, age hierarchy, and class. Families are often viewed as a safety net, offering physical, emotional, and financial protection in times of crisis. Whether it's a job loss, illness, a breakup, or mental health challenges, many people turn to family members for support. This protective function is one reason families are so central in both personal life and public policy. However, it's crucial to remember that not all families provide a safe or nurturing environment. In some cases, the family can be a site of harm, such as through domestic violence, neglect, or emotional abuse. So while we often idealize family as a haven, the reality is more complicated. Sociologists pay close attention to these contradictions, especially when thinking about who has access to support and who might fall through the cracks when the family doesn't provide it. Together, these elements, emotional connection, regulation of sexuality, power dynamics, and the capacity to protect or harm, show us that family is more than a legal or residential category. It's a social institution shaped by care, responsibility, and structure, but also by inequality, conflict, and variation. By understanding these patterns, we get a clearer picture of what families do and why they matter so much in everyday life. Let's shift our focus now to a more inclusive and flexible way of thinking about family, one that moves beyond fixed roles and traditional models. This is what we call a broad or expansive definition of family. Instead of asking whether a group fits into a specific mold, like two married parents with children, it looks at the strength of their relationships, their shared responsibilities, and the commitment they have to one another over time. This broader view highlights close social relationships and shared history as the foundation of family life. It acknowledges that families don't have to be based on legal or biological ties. Instead, what matters most is how people care for and support one another. For example, a single-parent household, a blended family with step-siblings, a same-sex couple raising children, or even a close-knit group of friends sharing a home can all be considered families when these bonds are present. One way to think about this is to ask, who do you call when something goes wrong? Who do you celebrate milestones with? Who shows up for you consistently, even if they're not technically family? These kinds of relationships often fulfill the same roles as traditional families, and sometimes do so even more reliably. Sociologically, this definition helps us understand how families adapt to changing circumstances. For example, rising rates of divorce, remarriage, and cohabitation mean that many people now experience multiple family forms over a lifetime. Immigration, globalization, and economic pressure also shape how people live together and share caregiving responsibilities. Some people maintain strong family ties across borders, while others build support networks in their local communities that function as chosen families. This broader perspective also has practical implications. When we recognize families based on emotional and practical bonds, we're better able to understand who needs support and how social policies should respond. For instance, recognizing common law partners or chosen families can be crucial for things like healthcare decisions, inheritance, or parental rights. So, defining family in broad terms means recognizing the diversity of how people actually live. It allows for greater inclusion and reflects the realities of modern life, where family is often defined less by traditional roles and more by connection, care, and mutual responsibility. This approach not only reflects today's social world more accurately, it also invites us to respect and validate a wide range of family experiences. Let's take a closer look at 6 core dimensions that help us understand how families function. These aren't about how families are structured. They're about the roles families play in society and how they support both individuals and communities. Procreation. Families often serve as the primary space for having and raising children. Whether through birth or adoption, families help bring new members into society. Even families without children exist within cultural expectations tied to reproduction and continuity. Socialization. Families are where social learning begins. They teach children basic norms, values, and behaviors. Everything from language and manners to gender roles, religious beliefs, and cultural traditions. Through this, families help shape our identities and prepare us for life in society. Regulation of sexual behavior. Most cultures use family to help set boundaries around sexual relationships. This includes defining who can be intimate with whom and what kinds of relationships are acceptable or taboo, like prohibitions against incest. These rules help maintain clear roles and social order. Residence. Family is often tied to shared living arrangements. Whether people live in nuclear households, multi-generational homes, or across long distances, residence patterns affect how families function. Where and with whom we live plays a big role in our daily family experience. Economic cooperation. Families usually share resources and responsibilities. This could mean pooling income, dividing chores, or supporting one another through midlife events like illness, job loss, or retirement. Economic cooperation is essential to how many families survive and thrive. Emotional ties. Emotional connection is often at the heart of family life. Love, care, and mutual support help create a sense of belonging. These ties can sustain families through difficult times, though not all families offer the same level of emotional support or security. Taken together, these 6 dimensions, procreation, socialization, sexual regulation, residence, economic cooperation, and emotional bonds, give us a useful framework for understanding family beyond appearances. Different families may emphasize some of these more than others, but all contribute to the social role that family plays. Now let's turn to a perspective known as the family decline hypothesis. This view argues that the traditional nuclear family is on the way out, and that's a problem. Supporters of this hypothesis point to changes like the rise in single-parent homes, blended families, and especially the absence of fathers. They argue that these shifts might affect children's emotional and social development because the traditional two-parent model is seen as providing greater stability. There's a particular focus on what's often called the erosion of fatherhood. In the traditional model, fathers were expected to be financial providers and authority figures. From this viewpoint, their declining presence is seen as a loss of structure, discipline, and emotional support in children's lives. Sociologically, this reflects a more conservative framework that views social stability as closely tied to family structure. But it's worth asking, but I think, is it the structure of the family that matters most, or the quality of the relationships within it? That's the core of the debate we're beginning to explore. The decline perspective also points to a range of broader trends. We've got more couples cohabiting without marriage, which is often framed as a rejection of traditional norms. Adult children moving back home, what some call boomerang kids, is interpreted as a sign that families are struggling with economic or emotional dependency. The rise in divorce is seen as weakening the institution of marriage itself. Technology also gets a lot of blame. Smartphones and social media are said to reduce face-to-face interaction, making family members more isolated even when they live under the same roof. Add to that chronic stress, economic instability, and illness, all of which put serious strain on family life. What we're seeing here is a set of social changes that are interpreted through a lens of loss and instability. It's a way of saying things used to be better, and now they're falling apart. But that interpretation depends heavily on what you consider to be the ideal family model in the first place. Now let's shift to a different way of looking at things, the family change perspective. This view doesn't deny that families are changing, but it sees that change as natural and even necessary. The key argument here is that families are adapting to modern life. What worked in the 1950s may not make sense in a society where people live longer, marry later, and pursue different roles. From this angle, diversity in family forms isn't a threat. It's a reflection of social progress and individual choice. This perspective also challenges the idea that there was ever a perfect family model. Even in the so-called golden age, many problems, like domestic violence, substance abuse, or poverty, were hidden or ignored. Just because families appeared stable doesn't mean they were healthy. Sociologically, this is a more dynamic view of family. It sees family not as a fixed institution, but as a social system that evolves alongside changes in gender norms, economic roles, and cultural values. Concerns about the decline of the family aren't new. They've surfaced repeatedly throughout history, especially during times of social change. These fears often reflect broader anxieties about shifting values, roles, and power structures. One key moment was the industrial era in the 18th and 19th centuries. As families moved from farms to cities, working long hours in factories, traditional extended households broke down. People worried that urban life and capitalism were tearing families apart and making it harder to raise moral, disciplined children. In the 1950s, the rise of youth culture sparked similar fears. Rock and roll, changing fashion, and teen rebellion were seen as threats to family values. The concern wasn't just about music. It was about a generation drifting from parental authority and long-standing norms. Then in the 1970s, as more women entered the workforce and divorce rates rose, critics claimed that changing gender roles were destabilizing families. Some blamed the feminist movement, suggesting that traditional family life couldn't survive without clear, fixed roles. What all of these moments show is a familiar pattern. When the family adapts to social or economic shifts, people often interpret those changes as decline. But sociologically, these changes usually reflect transformation, not collapse. Families evolve, and the fears that come with that often say more about the society around them than about the families themselves. To wrap up this chapter, let's take a look at the current landscape of families in Canada. The data gives us a helpful snapshot of how families are actually structured today and what that might mean for policy and everyday life. As of recent census data, about 68.4% of Canadian families consist of married couples, making this the most common family form in the country. So even though we've seen lots of change in how people form families, the traditional married couple model still plays a dominant role. However, we also see important diversity. Single-parent families make up about 16.1% of Canadian households. Most of these are headed by women, and they highlight the growing visibility of non-traditional parenting arrangements, families that often face unique economic and social pressures. Another significant group is common law families, which make up about 15.5%. These are couples who live together without being legally married. Their growing numbers reflect changing attitudes toward marriage and long-term commitment. For some, common law relationships are a conscious choice. For others, they're shaped by economic factors or legal flexibility. Sociologically, these figures tell us that while traditional forms are still common, there's no single normal family. Canadian families are increasingly shaped by personal choice, shifting gender roles, cultural diversity, and economic realities. And these trends have real implications affecting everything from housing policy and childcare funding to healthcare access and legal rights. So, understanding the Canadian family profile isn't just about numbers. It's about recognizing people build lives together and how society responds to that diversity.